No, es que ya volví a No importa. No importa. Se puede ver Windows. Normalmente sí se puede ver Windows. You want the big one. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Ronan, for your presentation. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to try to summarize them. I don't understand the distinction you make between ideology, values, and the other one was beliefs, because usually in work on ideology of language, that's the three of them are combined. And to what extent, I think one of the problems I have is, or the question that we should address is how beliefs or ideology becomes naturalized. And it's very interesting, it's shown actually in the reaction of the lady you told us about, who said that I don't speak. And it's something very common when you do field work. It's absolutely something very common. And the examples you gave, I could give you exactly the same ways speakers articulate their relationship with languages in Africa, in other parts of the world. Okay? So what is interesting is how these ideologies are naturalized by speakers, that they are no longer recognizable. Okay? I think that that's a very important point. And the other point I would like to make, so there's no, when you say the lady lied when she said she doesn't speak, it's not about lying or not. I mean, that shouldn't be part of our vocabulary to say the speaker lied. What is interesting is why the speaker produces this discourse. What are the social conditions that make speakers produce this or that discourse? Okay? And the other thing I would like to talk about is the notion of competence. You define competence as an individual thing. I don't think so. Competence is very social in the sense that competence, language competence, is ratified socially. You know, that somebody is damn competent in one language or another is a social thing. Okay, somebody can say, I speak good English, I speak bad English, I speak good Castilian or not. At the end of the day is, you know, the interaction that somebody has with somebody else, which lead to deem him or her the competence in the language. And I think in linguistics, we have focused on the speaker. I mean, when you look at the tradition in linguistics and how we have looked at competence from Chomsky, which is very desocialized, to Himes, which is highly socialized, but still it focuses on the speaker. And I think we have to shift the notion of competence, you know, to a more social approach, and saying that competence is very contextual. You can be damn competent in English in a context, whereas you won't be competent in English in another context. So it's highly contextual. You know, and as I think that we shouldn't. The notion of competence is highly social and no individual. So.
Well, that was a lot. The first one, ideology, beliefs, and values. Well, ideology. I defined it in the way Van Dijk did, and that's ideology defines group. Values is a component of ideology, and maybe part of it, may not. So I just wanted. That's a complex. Way to interpret it. For example, as I said, as Jerzy Smolich defines core values for example, is not necessarily an ideology, but it may be. It may be. And it's just a way to try not to call everything ideology and to divide in values and things that maybe just beliefs. Beliefs that seems to be more neutral, but it's not necessarily a value. Sometimes it seems to be a value, but it's not always sure that it is a value. So it's obviously, I did not try to bring in a precise notion, just to have a notion for something when it's not necessarily an ideology. And for me, I didn't consider as an ideology in the Marxist way. The Marxist way is, well, we are the, ideology is when people think they are worse than the other. That's the idea, just in a very general way. We are not as good as the other people. But here it is defined as we are a group and we some kind of identity. And the second one, no, there was something, this person, well, when I said she lied, it's, of course, I wanted to say, she didn't tell me the truth. She knows autonomy. It's the same. And of course. So we can get into this. It's not for well. It's for me not so important. That what I wanted to say is that many people deny their own language. And not if there is a truth or not, or if there's a lie. Or it's not important for me. It's just many people just say, we don't tell it, even among themselves. I had some speakers of autonomy said, well, that person said, don't tell me in autonomy, I don't understand it. And then I kept on speaking to another person in autonomy, and she joins the conversation. So she spoke autonomy. That was a point I wanted to try to bring out. And the last one, competence. Well, that's just a kind of definition. I want to define competence as something individual, and there are different authors who define it as a social phenomena, and others who define it as an individual phenomenon. I wanted to define competence as an individual phenomena, and brought into the other term for social phenomena. So you can say social competence to the other, and this might be the same.
Bé, ara tenim aquí una altra ecologia del professor Salikoko Mufuene de la Universitat de Chicago. Ell és un expert internacional reconegut en l'ecologia lingüística, sobretot perquè va posar l'accent en l'evolució, en una perspectiva evolucionària, evolucionista, i sobretot fent una ecologia més acostada, més inspirada en elements, diguem, biològics. Fins i tot en el sentit que en alguna de les seves obres proposa una mena de metàfora d'identificar la llengua com un paràsit o com un virus que viu en nosaltres. Nosaltres són els que traginem pel món les llengües i els virus. Bé, entre tota aquesta perspectiva, diguem, evolucionista i de la genètica de poblacions, ja veureu que farà una exposició molt interessant i ara des d'un punt de vista molt més macro que el que ens ha donat el Roland. El Roland era més aviat més micro de les comunitats. Heu vist que utilitzava una metodologia qualitativa amb entrevistes. Ara ell em sembla que agafarà, diríem, l'avió o el satèl·lit i el temps per entre les comunitats humanes per veure com ha creat això. Cal dir que ell està inspirat en el treball de camp per les seves investigacions sobre els criolls, la criollització, i per tant sobre l'emergència de noves formes lingüístiques, cosa que impugna, en molts casos, moltes dels elements teòrics establerts de la lingüística. Per això és tan interessant la seva aproximació. Thank you.
I'm very grateful to have been invited to this symposium. Frankly, I didn't know that I was doing complexity until I was invited. But it turns out, in comparing some of the things that I have done with the literature on complexity, maybe I have indeed been working on complexity. Okay, so what do we mean when we say languages are complex adaptive systems? Every now and then you will see language with S between parentheses, because I personally believe that that abstraction language wouldn't exist if there weren't any languages spoken around. And I don't think of the emergence of language in the singular. As far as human populations are concerned, I think of the emergence of languages. That's probably something that I won't have to discuss today, but I just wanted to introduce that caveat. We think of languages as complex adaptive systems because, among other things, they are modular, and the modules interface with each other. They are in constant interactions with each other, and that in itself produces complexity. They consist of many agents, which Professor Helliger talked about earlier today, and these agents interact with each other. The question is, how do we identify these particular agents? They respond adaptively to changes in the ecologies consisting of particular speakers, members of particular socioeconomic classes, in particular psychological states, and perhaps speaking other languages. So very often when we speak of ecologies, of the ecologies of languages, the first thing we think about is the socioeconomic context in which speakers evolve. In the way that I have been developing the notion of ecology, the key ecological factor or the key ecology to language is the human being, who is both the host to language and the shaper, creator, manufacturer of language. And everything in the larger external ecology is filtered through the speaker. And that's why I mentioned here speakers who are members of particular socioeconomic classes and who may be, or not maybe, are usually in particular psychological states, and perhaps maybe speaking other languages. And when every time you add these factors, things become more and more complex. And the ecologies also consist of the natural and material environments in which speakers evolve, because these environments largely determine what speakers are going to talk about, and they are going to develop vocabularies about these particular environments. Okay. And the changes that languages undergo reflect the particular equilibria they reach after chaotic transitions. So every now and then, there is a period when it is difficult, more or less, for people to communicate, and there are changes that are happening in the language. And the cases that have become the most obvious to us are those in which varieties known as pidgins and creoles have emerged. But you can imagine many other situations in which things have become more or less chaotic, and then languages have evolved into new states. The regularities that languages display are emergent patterns, subject to changes in the ecologies. As I said yesterday, a linguistic system is more or less like beauty. It lies in the eyes of the beholder, and everybody sees in it the kind of system that enables them to practice that language. And eventually what matters mostly is whether or not we are understood. And when we are not understood, that's probably the severest penalty. And you have to make adjustments because it serves no purpose for you to be speaking and nobody gets the message. And the changes that various classes of items undergo accumulations that occur gradually, one by one, driven analogically. What I want to say here, although in linguistics we are accustomed to saying, for instance, sonorants become these kind of things, or verbs of emotion behave this particular way. In reality, speakers don't wait until they realize they have the full list of emotion verbs and then say, now I'm going to apply this rule for the change and so forth. It's one item being modified, and then by analogy, another item that is similar to the one that has already been modified gets modified and so forth. And after a span of time, you notice that the whole class has been affected. As communal phenomena, languages display inter-individual variation. Thus, they are heterogeneous, which accounts partly for why they are typically in the state of flux and in search of equilibrium. Okay, when you pay attention to it, that's why we have the notion of idiolect. No two idiolects are similar. I'm sorry, no two idiolects are identical. Idiolects are only similar to some extent. Some idiolects are more similar than some other idiolects, and it depends on which particular individuals are interacting with each other and to what extent they are accommodating each other. But things become more complex because we don't live in populations where there are only 2 or 3 of us. We live in populations that contain a lot of individuals, but when we interact, it's hardly like what we are doing now. I'm speaking and you are listening to me. We interact dyadically or triadically, but those dyads and triads keep changing all the time, and so there is probably no end to all the accommodations that we are making to each other, and that's an important aspect of complexity, and I will return to this below. Now, an important question, if we want to think about languages as complex adaptive systems, is what are the agents in language as complex adaptive systems, or who are the agents in languages as complex adaptive systems? According to Beckner and others, which include John Halland, an authority on complexity theory, William Croft, an authority on language evolution, they say the agents are speakers. Think about it. According to Lee et al., including John Schumann, an expert on second language acquisition and also an expert on language evolution, the agents are sometimes the items in the system, and sometimes they are speakers. We are facing a question here, a problem, an issue. Okay? This is an understandable problem. Speakers as hosts and makers of their languages can't be part of the systems themselves. We make systems, we use them, therefore, by definition, we are not part of those systems. And in a way, in the tradition of linguistics, languages are separate from us. So when you say the agents of a complex adaptive systems are speakers, well, which is which? Okay? And speakers are at best the most immediate ecologists to languages. On the other hand, languages have no agency of their own. They have parasitic lives. And so this is something that we have to deal with, we have to explain. And what I want to say is both parties, even those that have claimed that the speakers are agents, are probably right, but only partly. That's part of the story. The structures of languages and the changes they undergo reflect the interactive activities of their speakers or makers, as some of them innovate and others copy, though the innovators and copiers vary according to specific features. And there are no individuals that have the monopoly of modifying everything in their language, and then the others just follow them. And there are no people who are just so lazy that they always cross their arms and wait for the innovators to produce the best language for them and they can follow. An important question is whether agents in complex adaptive systems are necessarily agentive, that is in the linguistic sense, or whether they are simply triggers of particular responsive behaviors of speakers. In other words, the changes that occur in the system will prompt speakers to make modifications, but as speakers make modifications, the systems change accordingly. So we are here in that kind of difficult relationship that I have just articulated since my book, The Ecology of Language Evolution, but I haven't been able to really answer, okay? Speakers are hosts to languages, but at the same time, they are the creators of languages. And when I say, for instance, that languages are more or less like viruses, where there is something that we have we must pay attention to. Viruses have external origins to their hosts, and they come and colonize their hosts. And that's not quite the same story with languages. We have a relationship that is kind of symbiotic. And somehow we have to try to sort things out here in a way that becomes more intelligible. The confusion suggests that there is more than one way of interpreting linguistic complexity. We must first think of languages as technology that evolve from the interactions of hominids and their descendants for the purposes of communication. And communal languages are extrapolations from idiolects, although evolutionary considerations have focused on the population-wide aspects of systems. In other words, here, if we really put things in perspective, languages, the way we linguists have been discussing them, don't really exist. They are constructs. If anything comes close to reality, it's another construct, and that is the idiolect. But the idiolect is a projection. The only thing physical that we can really show is speech. And I think that is why we need something like complexity theory to talk about all this. Complexity obtains in both the communal and idiolectal constructs, but not necessarily in the same way. So you can find complexity in the idiolect, and you are going to also find complexity in the communal language. But what you find in the communal, the kind of complexity you find in the communal language is an exponential consequence of the complexity that you already observe in the idiolects, plus the social dimensions that bring the different idiolects together as they compete with each other, or simply as they interact with each other. So, two perspectives on complexity. Speakers are more interesting agents from the perspective of the invisible hand that produces communal patterns as known as norms. They are also the actual producers of features of idiolects. In other words, as we communicate in our dyadic and triadic settings, we are concerned, we focus on being understood by the addressee, but every time we make adjustments, and we really have no sense of the direction in which things are evolving. But a person that has been observing us can come and tell us, hey, do you know that in your community you have converged towards saying things in particular ways, toward pronouncing some phonemes in specific ways that become specific to your own community, or in assigning specific meanings to words that may distinguish you from other populations. But what's the algorithm that really led us to that kind of convergence? We haven't developed it yet, and that's where complexity lies. Idiolects are more interesting from the point of view of structural complexity, which reflects the interfaces of different modules which in fact operate concurrently when we speak, and the interactions of different units within each module. Take, for instance, the phonological system. You have different sounds individually, but when you speak, these sounds are really in interaction with each other, like the devoicing of some voice stops that occur in particular contexts, or the devoicing of some glides that occur in particular environments, and that's because our articulators must go through some transitions as we produce the different sounds. That's an interesting aspect of interaction that in itself produces complexity. But as we speak, I don't know if anybody here would say, you know, first I plan how I'm going to produce these sounds in this word, and then I plan how I'm going to produce the word together, and then I plan how this word is going to combine with that other word. If anything, what we find here when we observe individuals in communication is that we have these very complex, sophisticated computers that are very modular, where there is some sort of division of labor. One part is focused on producing the sounds, the other part on the combinatorics of the sounds, the other part on matching the word with the meaning, but there's another part that is involved in the production of a whole utterance. And an utterance is something that we don't always plan fully when we start to speak, and every now and then we catch us in the process of producing an utterance that won't make any sense, and we start all over. Okay. The structural complexity of idiolects can, of course, be extrapolated to communal languages, provided allowance is made for various kinds of variation. But this is where historical linguists have been in business. This is where variationist sociolinguists have been in business, and so forth. Nonetheless, the real engine lies in the idiolects. Why is there complexity at the communal or population level? Because communal languages are collective productions. That's something I said earlier. Everything in a population, everybody in a population is engaged in the production of the language. No single speaker or group of speakers can claim the exclusive authorship of the language of their community. At different times, different individuals have alternately innovated features for their current needs, or introduced features from outside the system, or copied features from other speakers. What is particularly interesting here is we innovate so often, but there are so few of our innovations that make it to the communal level. They are eliminated. They just live very short lives, the utterance time. In different ways, different speakers have contributed to the variable characteristics of their communal language. In various ways, different speakers have accommodated each other during the different speech events. There is complexity in the ways different idiolects have converged toward communal norms in different dialects or sociolects and in different languages. It's curious how norms, which are not explicitly stipulated, emerge at all, because the most common interactions are dyadic or triadic, and the sets change frequently. And nobody has any foresight of where things are going to go. So this is when we have to be cautious when we speak of complexity and self-organization and the agents engaged in it as having particular goals. Maybe the goals of now of communication, but not goal of what the system is going to be like. That we cannot predict. The mutual accommodation speakers make to each other during the interactions go in all directions. The invisible hand, now replaced by self-organization, has been invoked because every speaker focuses on being understood in the hic et nunc of the interaction, not on the norms toward which they converge. Structural complexity is better approached by conflating phylogeny, which is, the whole history of mankind since the hominid species, and ontogeny in the evolution of language. That is, we must focus on the evolution of communal languages through the creative activities of individual hominids or humans jointly interested in communicating with each other. Uniformitarianism suggests that this protracted process always involves innovators and copiers alternating their roles. Paleontology suggests gradual, incremental emergence of language, not an abrupt process. A critical factor was the emergence of an individual and social mind that was capable of domesticating the hominid and human anatomy to produce the necessary spoken or sign technology to establish communication. And this is one way of looking at the ecology of language. No language could have emerged if the human mind hadn't evolved to the point where it knew what part of the body to use and how to use it to produce the technology that we call language. A good example here is you see the parrot, for instance. The parrot can imitate us speaking, but the parrot cannot speak simply because the parrot doesn't have the right mind to speak. On the other hand, the parrot teaches us something else. It's by accident that our bicopharyngeal configuration from the throat to the mouth, or you can go to the lungs, has been domesticated to where we can produce speech the way we do. The parrot teaches us you don't really need this specific bicopharyngeal structure because the parrot has no teeth, no tongue comparable to ours, and the voice is produced by the syrinx, which is just at the top of the lungs and not where it is among humans. So this is an interesting thing. And the parrot, however, cannot use that particular equipment to speak the way we do because the parrot cannot produce the kind of conceptual structure that comes along with language. And that multifacetedness of language creates the kind of complexity that makes human languages so interesting. It isn't clear how communication evolved from vocalizations and gestures to speech and signs, respectively. Speech is more symbolic and strictly bound by linearity, while signing involves more iconicity and is less bound by linearity, but both are discrete or digital or articulate systems. Syntax or combinatorics on all levels seems to be a consequence of linearity, which is a consequence of the modality, assuming there is a more abstract level of language that is separate from the physical, phonetic, or signing modalities. Earlier this morning, somebody asked the question of universal grammar. What I'm suggesting here is very subversive, suggesting that you cannot really think about universal grammar without sorting out first what are the properties of language that are consequences of the modalities that we are using in this particular technology. So the fact of using sounds, for instance, in speech, makes it impossible to produce two sounds at the same time, and that is the basic principle of linearity. And we are dealing with combinatorics. And they come all the way from phonological combinatorics to syntax. And there are a number of things that we needn't really assign to a particular universal grammar. If anything belongs to universal grammar, it's going to be something more mentalistic, something more abstract, and something that we should prove that in assuming that language is a kind of technology using particular materials, we are not using a general learning purpose that only some minds can use, but doesn't require a specialized module that we would call a language module or a biological endowment for language or bioprogram or whatever in our minds. The question may now be that of mapping the more abstract conceptual aspects of language to the physical aspects of language. And so at some point, a question more complex is going to arise. Is language particularly the abstract part only? Or is language the combination of the abstract part of communication with the technological part, the mechanics that we find in speech or in signing? In communication, complexity arises partly from the mapping of conceptual structures onto the means provided by speech or signing. Complexity arises in part from the interaction of the modality and the conceptual production, as both processes are concurrent. Feedback from one's own experience and from the addressee through the cues they give back to the speaker or signer adds to complexity. The mapping itself is a complex multimodular process, as the different modules are all concurrently engaged in the utterance production process, phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, all engaged concurrently. The way we produce or process utterances does not suggest that there was strict chronological sequences in the evolution of different modules. Emergentism may be the way to explore how language evolved phylogenetically while people were more involved with communicating vocally or manually up to what their minds enabled them to express. In other words, just as we observe in language acquisition, we can assume that there was no period in human phylogeny where hominids spent so many hundreds of thousands of years just trying to produce sounds in isolation and producing no words. And then at some point said, now we got it. Our mouths can produce phonetic inventories, now let's focus on producing words. And then they waited another 200,000 of years or so and said, now we got it, we got the words, let's think of putting the words together. If it worked that way, then you can say, then they already had the language, they were just trying to go from one language to another, why did they bother in the first place? So there is something more complex that has taken place that we have to look into. Naming entities, activities, conditions, or states may be what drove the emergence of phonetics and signs in the first place, perhaps in response to the need to identify the same entities, activities, conditions, and states by the same terms or labels, which is what we call conventionality, a reflection of joint attention and collaboration among humans. And these factors are the ones that people like Michael Tomasello have identified as important ecological factors in the emergence of language in mankind, because we have joint attention, and joint attention can direct us to collaborate, can direct us to develop division of labor, who does what in the family, and how do we evolve toward the same goals in our lives. And for that, we need communication. Did the full phonetic inventories of individual languages evolve overnight? Probably not. As the hominid human cognitive capacities grew grew in competence, in capacity to process things, so the vocabulary grew. The phonetics must have expanded accordingly, like you need more words, and maybe you need more sounds to produce more words, and things evolve more or less concurrently. And so the phonetics must have expanded accordingly to the size where various combinations could produce as many words as the speakers or signers needed. Phonetic complexity shouldn't be reduced to the size of the inventory. Various interactional conventions can lead to rich vocabularies regardless of the size of the phonetic inventory. And here, for instance, we think of Hawaii, that is one of those languages with the smallest inventories. But something very interesting happens in Hawaiian. I visited Honolulu and was reading the street signs, the street names, and all of them are very long. But there is also something in the way that syllables vary. So when you take a language like this and you compare it with a language such as English, where you have a large phonetic inventory, look how many constraints you have. You cannot have a word initial syllable that starts with a nasal followed by a consonant, those kinds of things. Whereas in a language where you have a CV structure, okay, instead of having short words in which you can use so many different sounds but under so many different constraints, you can just say, we are going to have so many syllables, but so that we don't confuse things, we are not going to have a word that has only syllables with a as a syllabic peak. We are going to have alternations, say, between a and and so forth, and we can form longer and longer words. So in other words, there are different ways in which you can develop competing technologies with exactly the same basic materials. This is what we find with our computers, what we find with our cars, with our boats, with smallest tools that we use in our homes. Different manufacturers design them differently, and they all do the same jobs. In the end, it's what am I more familiar with? My wife has been trying to convince me to switch to the Mac system, but I'm more familiar with the PC system, and I'm wedded to it, you know? So these are some of the things that happen in life. As in ontogenetic development, cognitively more complex minds must have evolved beyond merely naming entities and activities. Modest forms of predication about entities and situations must have fostered the emergence of syntax and words. So as the vocabulary grew more complex with names for entities and names for activities and so forth, it must have become necessary to talk about some of these entities, and that's the origin of predication. And that's also the origin of syntax, as primitive as it may be. And the emergence of sentences may have fostered the emergence of ways of specifying reference in the noun phrase and time in the verb phrase through use of relevant specifiers. What I mean here is that it's no longer enough to say animal chase me. So you have to make sure whether it is an animal that you have already talked about or whether it's an animal that you just saw for the first time, and those kinds of things. And you have to say whether the chasing took place yesterday or in the past is taking place now or it will take place in the future. And so this would reflect the way the mind itself evolved. And as the mind evolved, a relevant vocabulary evolved, but a relevant way of talking about the environment also grew in complexity. Complex sentences must have taken time to evolve, assuming some developments may presuppose other earlier developments. Syntactic complexity needn't be reduced to number of rules or constraints and levels of embedding, although all this matters too. There are undoubtedly some strategies that use more formal mechanisms than others. Embedding apparently does more than serialization, and polysynthesis certainly more than isolating morphosyntax, though polysynthesis is more transparent than isolating and fusional morphosyntax. So there is some sort of trade-off. You can complicate the machinery, but as you complicate the technology, things become more transparent. Polysynthetic languages are not necessarily more difficult to process. They actually can be very easy because you look at the verb, you know what the subject, what the agent is, what the patient is, what the instrument is, and then in the rest of the sentence, you match the different parts. You have it. Things are so transparent. When you have an isolating language and you say, Bob die is one thing, and you say, Bob kill, the structure is the same, but the interpretation is not the same. Bob die may mean Bob has died. Bob kill may mean Bob has been killed. And so, or John walks versus John loves mean different things, because one being an activity verb may actually refer to the past, although you use it in the present, whereas with the verb love, because it is stative, the interpretation is in the present. So it's not just the form, it's also the interpretive rules that come for the forms. And so it may be too simplistic to say this language is more complex because it has so many different morphemes, and this language is simple because it doesn't have as many morphemes. Everywhere you have modules that are interacting in different ways, and it becomes kind of difficult to compare languages with respect to complexity. If complexity arises from the interaction of agents or components and modules in a system, then no particular strategies needn't be assumed to make some languages more complex than others, unless all is reduced to the mechanics of the physical aspects of language, and language being technology in this particular case. Serializing languages needn't be considered simpler than embedding languages, not any more than polysynthetic languages need to be considered more complex than isolating or fusional languages. Complexity based on the interactions of agents or components or modules needn't be confused with the number of elements packed together in the syntactically next higher unit. From the perspective of mapping the conceptual onto the physical aspects of languages, allowance must be made for typological variation. Regarding the phylogenetic emergence of language, the paleontological evidence favors polygenesis over monogenesis. You have to remember East Africa, out of which mankind dispersed, Homo sapiens dispersed, is not a village. And the paleontological fossils have been found scattered all over East Africa. So it is very likely that different populations in East Africa develop languages at more or less the same stage of evolution, but languages that were not necessarily identical in structure, because there is no particular reason why they need to be so. We can't always explain why some populations chose different strategies from others, even if their options fall in the minority. What matters is that there is no language that does not involve interactive complexity, especially between the modules, though they vary in bit complexity within different modules. But we must return to the question of whether the different modules develop independently. Phonetics and the lexicon seem to have emerged concurrently, though phonetics must have stopped at some point while the lexicon continued to evolve. Excuse the typo. Lexical growth seems to have fostered syntax, and the need to specify reference and time must have fostered morphology and more syntax, though the division of labor has varied from one language to another. Being an aspect of cognition, semantics appears to have driven the whole evolutionary process. If we must make sense of the model